Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books and Film, a podcast series on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Pete Kunze. My guest today is Landon Palmer, assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media at the University of Alabama, and the author of Rockstar, Movie Star, Power and Performance in Cinematic Rock Stardom. The book was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Hey, Landon, how are you today?
Doing all right, Pete. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you for being with me today, and welcome to the podcast. To begin, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and your training?
Sure. So I primarily consider myself a film historian. As you read, I'm assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media at the University of Alabama, and I mostly teach the film courses here. I initially wanted to go to film school and become a screenwriter and things like that, and then I really fell in love with my film studies classes and learned that could be a career, right? But one other area that I've always been interested in is music. I'm not a musician. I don't have a firsthand music background. And so the kind of approach to film history that I ended up developing during my graduate studies at Indiana University is that I first and primarily consider myself a film historian, focusing on Hollywood during the kind of post-classical period, broadly speaking. After the early 1950s, Hollywood's competition with television, the dissolution of the studio system, things like that. But my approach is kind of looking at Hollywood in intersection with other media industries, because I feel like in order to understand Hollywood during that period, you have to understand its changing and evolving relationship to finance, to electronics, and to, in this case, the recording industry. And so for me, the way that I kind of landed on this project, beyond just being somebody who enjoyed listening to rock and roll growing up, is that rock stars provided for me kind of a material way to think about the changes that were taking place, because our stars themselves are both commodities and laborers within the industry. So that's how I landed on this, and that became my dissertation, which then I, like many first books, adapted into my first book.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that? What is both representative and exceptional about the rock star, and how did it become a useful, let's say, cipher or prism for you to kind of get into not just film history, but particularly film history from an industrial perspective?
Right. So I think rock stars kind of embody certain things. I think it makes them really useful and interesting as a frame to understand this period. One is that as stars, they kind of function very differently from, say, classical Hollywood era movie stars, where classical Hollywood era movie stars are kind of, nodes within the studio system, had, incredibly restrictive contracts, had to kind of embody the ideas of certain studios. When rock stars started kind of starring in films, the ideology of rock stardom was something very different as a mode of stardom, which is to say that the kind of idea of a rock star is somebody who is expressing individuality and selfhood and autonomy through their music, through their expression of music. And also I use in the book, I think it's David Shumway, his definition of rock stars as people who embody cultural controversies. So being able to express culturally, kind of confrontational, perhaps progressive, perhaps not, ideas about identity and self-expression made them altogether different. And so when studios started seeing popular music stars as useful for their own purposes in this period after the studio system, rock stars also, they kind of brought something different into that matrix of how it was that stardom was supposed to work in movies. Another thing too is that I define rock stars in my book as embodying performances of alterity, and that's kind of like a that's kind of my academic way of saying that they kind of performed ideas about difference, performed ideas about racial difference, gender difference, difference in terms of sexuality. But of course, as is well known to most people listening to this, they themselves were not diverse. That it was principally white men who had the privilege to articulate these performances. And so I think that there are a lot of interesting contradictions that exist there as well. But because rock stars kind of embodied this idea of autonomy, which was different than how stardom had traditionally worked in Hollywood, that very much kind of created a lot of conflict in terms of just the work of film production. I detail this in my Beatles chapter, for example, how they came into conflict with United Artists over the terms of their contract. So, the book covers rock stars in movies from the 1950s to the 1990s. So it's a long period, that's probably more than one would responsibly define as classical Hollywood. But what I think is interesting about these particular figures I look at, and that's Elvis Presley, the Beatles, David Bowie, and Madonna, and I also have a chapter on concert documentaries, is that they present different iterations of what it means to kind of express or embody cultural controversies through motion pictures. And they also entail kind of different role of the rock stars themselves within the kind of chain of command in movie making, and how the power of labor is distributed in Hollywood.
That was wonderfully succinct. I'm hoping we can kind of flesh it out a little bit more with a case study to kind of exhibit what you kind of just covered for us. And I'm looking at the beautiful cover of your book, and this shot in particular of what appears to be David Bowie on set. So for you, how does David Bowie come to embody these controversies, conflicts, performances of alterity?
Mm-hmm. So, well, this book, as the cover indicates, it started for me personally with David Bowie and with the film The Man Who Fell to Earth. And I love Nicholas Roeg. He's one of my personal favorite filmmakers. And just his performance in that movie is something that I've always found fascinating in of itself, but also in the fact that Bowie is not performing any music in the film. And that he kind of translates this, this authoring of himself as a science fiction character, that becomes translated, his persona becomes translated into this film. But his music does not. And so David Bowie, as I argue in that chapter, had this kind of approach to, refashioning himself through embodying various personae, through kind of literally kind of frequently changing his fashion, his own iconography through his hair color, through his costuming, through the personas that he exhibited in his music. And what I think is really interesting about David Bowie's career, and I trace it from 1976 with The Man Who Fell to Earth to 1986 with Labyrinth, which is his last major starring film role. Of course, not his last film role, but his last major starring one. Because that's a period that kind of moves from the so-called new Hollywood era into a kind of more conglomerate Hollywood in the 1980s. And music plays a really important role in terms of that transition. And so in the 1970s, music provided, a way for filmmakers to kind of practice breaking the so-called rules inherited from classical Hollywood, right? Thinking about like the Sounds of Silence montage in The Graduate as an example, right? Mm-hmm. But then as Hollywood studios consolidated during a period of deregulation in the 1980s, Hollywood became very much, part of like a corporate umbrella in which studios were part of a satellite of a corporation that also included, say, record companies. And so this is the phenomenon known as synergy, where film music synergy kind of provides an economic system for films and music to cross promote one another. The Top Gun soundtrack and its music videos, I think, is a great example of this. And so Bowie, has starring roles across this period, across this like really interesting transitional decade in terms of film music. And for David Bowie, what I think is really fascinating about his career is that I kind of think about he's almost like the least controversial figure of this book, because even though he is embodying ideas about gender and sexual difference throughout his music and throughout his movies, his kind of refashioning of himself makes him an ideal kind of star laborer within Hollywood, and is able to kind of navigate its many transitions, and is able to kind of be there as kind of an icon to help kind of express musical ideas without actually having to perform music himself. And I think it's, moments like the opening credits of Tony Scott's The Hunger, where he is, he and Catherine Deneuve are in a goth club watching Bauhaus play, and is, I think, a really telling moment where, he is there kind of in Justin Wyatt's terms to present, fashionable ideas of selfhood that fit within the economy of Hollywood at this time. And I could go on, but I mean, one other thing that's fascinating about it is that, his, he continues to find, good work in the 1980s during this period of backlash against the gay rights movement. And he, in terms of his own music persona, kind of quote unquote straightens out a little bit, by the early to mid 1980s. Yet his film performances, I think, are far more androgynous and kind of fit more within his 70s persona. So I think David Bowie is a very kind of complicated case where he is kind of putting forth these performances of alterity, but in terms of kind of the economy of entertainment media at the same time, he's actually like kind of I call him kind of an ideal worker, that even though he is this persona that was once seen as strange, and you can kind of see this from some behind the scenes material at the time of some of the movies that he made, where his castmates will say, "Oh yeah, he was a really good actor. He showed up on time," and things like that. That persona was not inconsistent with him being an ideal laborer within the changing economy of Hollywood.
Yeah, and I think many listeners, particularly those in media studies, will hear kind of currents in your work of political economy of communication in terms of your interest in structure and transition, as well as cultural studies, right, in terms of focusing on these questions of textuality and these questions of negotiation and the conflicts therein. So this is going to transition to two questions that I kind of think of as my dissertation advisor questions. So pardon me on that. But the first is, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about how you see this project taking up and contributing to the fields of media industry studies and the field of star studies.
Yeah, those are, that's an accurate characterization of those questions. I appreciate it though. I think that, first off, I think I have seen, and this book was kind of a response to what I saw as a growing interest in so-called transmedia stars, and stars whose images cross boundaries between media. And I initially kind of focused on that in the dissertation version. I tamped that down in terms of the book. And because while I think transmedia it's a useful concept and framework to understand this, I don't, what I think about in terms of what these stars are doing is gradually kind of accommodating to what was kind of a vertical media landscape to a more horizontal. I also have an article in Celebrity Studies on Iggy Pop that kind of builds upon this as well. And in the book, what I'm one thing that I'm trying to do here is to historicize and contextualize the cross-media presence that we expect of stars today. And so to basically kind of look at kind of pre-digital iterations of what it means to cross and be conversant within these supposed boundaries between different media forms. I think, for example, every now and then I'll see something show up in entertainment news and gossip that I wish I could have included in the book. Like a few weeks ago, Chappell Roan said that she does not want to contract herself to movies because that would basically kind of take up an entire month of the year to be contracted to shoot on film, and that would inhibit her ability to basically freely move through and do and be autonomous and do what it is that she wants to do. And to me, that's kind of one of the keys here, which is just like, what does entertainment media labor mean in an increasingly atomized mediascape, right? And as historians stress, like, nothing started this particular moment, right? There are always these precedents that have come before, and I also think too, kind of maybe methodologically, one thing that I really tried to approach within this book is to have a kind of comprehensively materialist approach to understanding star images. So I look at stars, films and music careers, of course, but I also look at all that in relation to archival materials documentation that found the archives, and as well as anything kind of ancillary from record covers to music videos, public interviews, things like magazine covers and things like that, which that is very consistent with how I've learned that star studies works, but that there is kind of a combination between the discursive analysis of stars, as Richard Dyer has practiced, and kind of a media industries approach as well. And so to kind of maybe put some of those questions together, I think that we can look at the process and the product of stars as, not metonymic of media industries, but to see them as both laborers and products. And for me, a label like transmedia stardom doesn't really get to that, because stardom has always been articulated across media in some form or another. And so for me, the methods I developed in this book, I think, are useful for both examining star text and thinking of the role that they played within these greater contexts as well.
Yeah, no, that was one of the things I really appreciated about your project and motivated that question was, how do we combine these subjects within our field that are often treated in a symbolic way, in a more material way, and kind of synthesize those approaches, right? What is the role of the text in media industry studies, especially when that text is expanding and ongoing, and how is it motivated by someone who's not just an image but is a laborer, right? And I think that comes to the fore here. The other dissertation question, which you were already gesturing toward, is when you decide to tackle a project like this, how do you decide what methods to pull in, or what methods became useful for you to answering the kinds of questions that were interesting you as you endeavored to study the rock star in this kind of transhistorical context, but also to understand rock star itself as a historically contingent and developing construct?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I had to do with this project is, at the very least, just develop parameters in terms of which subjects I was going to look at, right? Because, one question that I get a lot that I appreciate you not asking is, what about this person, right?
Right.
And because there are so many other examples of this, and I want to be careful not to like look at my case studies as exemplary or comprehensive, but rather to just kind of mine the different ways in which each of these stars tells us about something particular in terms of the relationship between stars and media industries. And I think, just to go back to your earlier question, I think media industry studies has just been, for me, a really productive way of just meeting some of the kind of political economy concerns that you mentioned before with, more sensitive, nuanced cultural studies methods than, were practiced in terms of, say, like, Adorno and Horkheimer. And so for me, I worked under an archival historian, and before I got to Indiana University, that's not really something that I considered. I thought film studies was, looking at films and analyzing films and looking at other discursive materials. And so Greg Waller, my advisor, kind of really opened up for me kind of the possibilities of what it is that the archive can reveal. And so for me, especially because I think for me personally, in terms of what personally motivated this project, was wanting to kind of know more about something that felt kind of ineffable to me about the experience of, seeing a rock star perform in some way in the moving image, right? And to your work, Pete, one thing that I think is really revealing about the archive is not just like, okay, what are the conditions in which this particular film got made, and therefore, what happened in terms of what led to what's on screen, but also what didn't get made. What were some, what are the unmade films that happened along the way, and those are just as revealing about, priorities within the industry and the parameters of possibility, at this particular time. But I'll give you one example, which is in the Elvis chapter. I talk about a film, Wild in the Country, that he made in 1960. Yeah, 1960. And there's a moment in that film, 30 minutes into the film, and the film up to this point doesn't have like it's kind of a light James Dean style melodrama about this rebellious young man played by Elvis Presley who lives in a small town in the South. And all of a sudden, Elvis's character is driving his girlfriend out onto a date, and he just starts serenading her and singing. And this non-diegetic, or in musicals, it's the line can be kind of blurred, but this music kind of comes out of nowhere to support him. And I watched that, and I remember just thinking, how the hell did this scene get into this movie? This is such an incongruous moment. And thankfully for me, I got lucky. My archival research like directly answered that question. So I think at this point I've lost the tail of what your question was, but I think
it's method. So you're still on track.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, will you repeat the question again?
It was more about method, right? So
Okay,
you're saying about how you had one of those moments as a historian that I think most of us long for, which is you have a question that the archive can answer rather than letting the archive shape the questions, right? So it's interesting to see once you have the archival work is rich here, but but also star studies as a field, as I think of it, right, is largely textual and discursive analyses, right? So I'm wondering what other tools kind of became necessary to kind of supplement what you were finding in the archive.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I do try to hold on to in my work, is to be able to focus on textual analysis. It is still important to me to kind of hold on to textual analysis. I do know that like there's work, say, within new film history approaches and a lot of media industry sites for which textual analysis is not necessary. But I do try to position, as I kind of illustrated that Elvis example, as kind of the text in relation to what it is that I can surmise from the archive, right? And what it is that this kind of final manifestation of this project tells us. I didn't necessarily get as lucky with like every single thing as I did with some of the Elvis stuff. There's some reasons why Elvis's his kind of history in filmmaking was more available to me than some of these other figures because of his kind of embeddedness within Hollywood studios. And so the archive of this is, much better preserved just by the structure of the industry itself and how it accounts for what it does. For the David Bowie chapter and the Madonna chapter, I did not really have that. And so, in terms of discourse, I did very much kind of rely on interviews. I do think that probably shaped my approach and my argumentation, because in both of those chapters, I'm looking at how it is that Bowie and Madonna authored themselves in terms of the cinematic expression of their identity. I know that the Victoria and Albert Museum is just now kind of starting to open up David Bowie's archives to the public. Had that happened before I wrote this book, I don't know if that chapter would be altogether different. But I do think that, yes, the archive sometimes had answers to my questions, but archival materials and their relative availability certainly shaped my questions as well. But with both Madonna and David Bowie, there were just reams of magazine coverage and also interviews that they conducted, and both of them are particularly interesting, given how kind of inconsistent sometimes they could be in interviews in terms of their understanding of what it is that they are trying to do in terms of authoring themselves, in terms of their own political and cultural goals. And so one of the difficulties here in terms of this question about methods was, kind of where to place the myth, right? Where to place this kind of self mythology, or just general mythologies that occur around these figures. So my goal here isn't necessarily just to say demystify, right? To just kind of to kind of take the myth and look under the hood, but to try to find some sort of kind of middle ground between why are these discourses prevalent about these figures, but also what was actually happening in context of looking at them as also kind of byproducts of the political economies in which they worked.
Mm-hmm. And so, speaking of those political economies, one of the things that you and I share in our work is our interest in, let's say, the areas of the culture industries that don't often get studied alongside the media industries, right? Obviously, music industry is crucial here, but it often has been taken up by musicologists or pop culture scholars, although there's a robust number of folks in our field who have looked at that kind of convergence. I'm curious to hear what you saw in looking at the rock star about the nature of the relationship over time between the recording industry and the music industry more largely, and the film industry.
Yeah. So to kind of maybe reframe your question a bit, one thing, because the department that I worked in, my advisor with whom I worked, was kind of, in the position of kind of being a new historian, the one of the major methods in that area is to look at things that have been like forgotten, so to speak, to the major arcs by which we understand film history, right? Mm-hmm. And that work is incredibly valuable. A couple of things that I've published has been along those lines. But the way that I kind of thought about this project, and I think about a lot of my work, is to try to approach rather familiar subject matter differently. right?
Hmm.
I think you're right that, say, there hasn't been, say, a ton of scholarship written about necessarily maybe David Bowie movies, so there has been a lot more in recent years. But to kind of look at something, to look at figures who are familiar to people, if not already within scholarship, and to try to think about them differently. And so, for me, I think maybe the two chapters, while I feel like they all fit together really well, the two chapters that really kind of provide the impetus for this project was the David Bowie one and the Elvis one. And the Elvis one, I think, is really well. I would give you kind of a framework for this. So, if you've seen the Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie, his movie career is kind of covered in this one scene where, like, he's in a trailer on a studio set, and it's just kind of a little interstitial scene in between him coming back from being in the army and then doing the 1968 special. And that is often the way that the history of Elvis Presley is narrativized, which I think is fascinating, because this period between 1960 and 1968 is like the longest kind of continuous stretch of his rather short career. And during that period, he's churning out movies, right? But those movies are widely looked at, and this is a sentiment that's been repeated in some scholarship as just kind of undistinctive, unremarkable, and not necessarily worthy of attention. I'm not here arguing that these are misunderstood masterpieces or anything like that, but they are historically interesting. They, especially because they are part, I think, to the point of your question, they're part of a 1960s that is not as routinely canonized, is not how dominant narratives would prefer to think about 1960s Hollywood, right? And so, but they are very much byproducts of 1960s Hollywood, and very sustained ones at that, because he was able to star in, over 24 movies within, say, like an 8-year period.
Mm-hmm.
And and so to kind of go back and to think, like, why is that? What are we missing in terms of not, in terms of kind of dismissing Elvis Presley's career? Is it true that all these movies were kind of, run of the mill, undistinctive? And for me, the answers to those questions turned out to be a lot more complicated. And similarly, there are a lot of films that are there's some films here that are very much like in the canon of rock and roll movies, say A Hard Day's Night and stuff like that. And I do a similar amount of work contextualizing those as well. But, the circumstances that made Yellow Submarine, which the Beatles had tangential involvement with, or Magical Mystery Tour, or why I want to call it Get Back, but that's the newest word. Let It Be. Are tell us just as much about kind of what commercial filmmaking between the UK and the US was interested in at that particular point in time. And this book also was published before Get Back was made, before Peter Jackson and Disney Plus looked at all these materials and reorganized them into this program that could only really exist on a streaming service or on television, rather than the recording and concert film it was initially intended to be. And so to me, both there seems to me to be kind of a continuation in terms of these works as kind of byproducts of evolving industrial needs and contexts.
So to come at this question from another angle too, I was curious in thinking about your focus in particular on the rock star of the time you give in your introduction to the presidents, right? Like with a C. And you know, thinking about people obviously like Al Jolson or Eddie Cantor, but you mentioned in particular Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra as this kind of pre rock star moment of convergence between the music industry and the film industry. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about, with particularly Crosby and Sinatra, how is that a very different moment, right, for the music industry and the film industry than the period where you're spending the bulk of your time? I hope that's not an annoying question where it's like, I know you wrote about this, but
No,
but talk about when you know, what's the change towards, you know, what is, I guess the simple version of this is, what is different about stardom and the convergence between these industries during those kind of going my way, from here to eternity moments versus, you know, as someone who's in New Orleans, King Creole and, you know, that kind of Elvis rock star moment in the music industry, film industry convergence.
Yeah. So two things there. The rise of television,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about rock and roll as an initially kind of televisual music genre in terms of its moving image expression, and how that migrated into movies. And then secondly, the gradual rise of the long playing record as the kind of defining commercial music format, and how the idea of the album kind of played into that. And that also was important in terms of the changing aspects of the film industry in terms of kind of accommodating and trying to cross promote with the record industry in the form of film soundtracks, you know, and Elvis Presley's Blue Hawaii is up there with West Side Story as one of the best selling soundtracks of the 1960s. So, you know, it is not a sharp change. One of the things that I think is really important about some of the figures that I mentioned, I think like Rudy Valley is a really good example of this, which is that, you know, performers like him were quite integral to the transition from silent filmmaking into sound film and talkies, right? You know, the kind of synchronous sound program that played before Don Juan in 1926, you know, was a cavalcade of different musicians, right? And so musical performance becomes part of the spectacle of the big screen. In regards to Bing Crosby, I think he is such a useful precedent in terms of, you know, his direct interest in reel-to-reel recording. And so for me, somebody like Bing Crosby, he's an important antecedent to this, because his interest in reel-to-reel recording is about his interest in basically being able to be present upon multiple different forms of media at once, you know, in terms of pre-recorded radio programs and things like that. And so that idea of kind of to what degree do stars participate in the self-authoring of their image. Frank Sinatra, quite frankly, is somebody who, you know, I wish I kind of got a better fit on a little bit more in terms of coming into this project. I do think that he is fascinating and useful in terms of thinking about masculinity with respect to these types of performances from male rock stars that we see. And also in terms of kind of making that transition of legitimating himself from a quote unquote musical star to a dramatic star, right? Which is something that is very much part of the conversation in terms of Elvis's career, etc. But for me, the rock stars are important because they enter filmmaking during this moment of destabilization for the motion picture industry after the fall of the studio system. And because the fall of this, the kind of dismantling of the studio system also happens, kind of while facing television, that, especially as I begin with the Elvis chapter, Hollywood studios said, oh, Elvis Presley, he's useful. for what it is that we want to try to do and be and adapt to within this new landscape. But I also think another thing to point to your question, and something that I considered a lot going into this, was if I'm looking at rock stars, who does that leave out, right? And looking at rock stars in film, very much means that this is a book that is predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly focused on white men and white men's performances. And so in terms of the performances of alterity that I was talking about earlier, one thing that I think, is useful here is to kind of think about, in order to make that leap from a music star to a film star, these performers had to get to a certain tier of success in terms of being a music star, right? Mm-hmm. And Elvis Presley was the rock and roll artist who was elevated from an independent record label to a major record label with RCA. And he was elevated due in part to the fact that he is white. He is this, white packaging of Black vernacular music. And, Chuck Berry had film roles. Little Richard had film roles. They did not have the sustained film careers that Elvis had, precisely for the reasons that you think, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so my focus in this book was to kind of be cognizant of that, and to think about how does Elvis kind of, in many ways that he did similarly to radio and television, kind of perform racial difference in a way, while also having the privilege of his whiteness in order to have a sustained film career. But that also meant, because I was looking at rock, and because I think rock is interesting in terms of its politics and ideology and how that informs performance, that means that that a whole host of other popular musicians who translate to film are left out as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious in passing, as I was reading your discussion of Elvis, on Twitter a week or two ago, there was a clip circulating of Ray Charles being interviewed by Bob Costas. Yeah. Obviously, it would have been like 20, 30 years ago now. And Costas was kind of fishing for Charles to compliment Elvis. And, Charles kind of just bats it away and is like, what did he do that was so monumental? But it had me really thinking about, like, it's one thing to think about Elvis's legacy as an icon, right? But in terms of what he did for the form or the art, it really does draw attention to those politics that I think you're kind of parsing out here with your performances of alterity concept, right? I mean that in some ways it's less about what Elvis did than what he was able to mine or what he was encouraged to mine, regardless, depending on how we think of the agency there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the ways in which he was useful, right? Mm-hmm. And, I talk about self-authoring with respect to Madonna and David Bowie, and that's very much not present with respect to Elvis. And Elvis, although I was able to get the greatest volume of archival material, none of it was directly from him.
Right.
All, Carlton Parker and producer
Hal Wallace,
all talking about what they could do with Elvis, right? Yeah. So I think I think that's right. I think that's the most historically interesting and useful way to look at him in this context, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So developing this notion of a kind of race and musicianship and performance that comes up through this focus on alterity, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about Madonna and how she kind of operates in here for you.
Yeah. So Madonna was not she was not part of the dissertation. I wrote this additional chapter for the book, and I listened to Korea Longworth's podcast, and I love it. And she had this episode of Madonna, and she was making the case that Madonna is a cinephile. And so I started thinking about that and looking back at her movies. I had seen Dick Tracy and League of Their Own before, and Suddenly Seeking Susan, but I I hadn't seen Who's That Girl, or the movie that she made with Sean Penn, or some of the stuff that's kind of a bit has been closer to forgotten or discarded now. And Madonna's film career is something that was widely mocked at the time, um, and widely dismissed. And looking back at her film career, it's really, really fascinating. And you can kind of see how it is that she is trying to express this kind of old school idea of stardom. I compare her in the chapter to Mae West, how when Mae West was making movies in the early 1930s that were adapted from her stage plays, many of them were set in the 1890s. And Mae West kind of mined the past in order to deal with cultural controversies of the then present. And that's exactly what Madonna did for many of her film roles after Desperately Seeking Susan. Is kind of to act in these either period pieces or films that were kind of evocative of kind of a pastiche, evocative of kind of a Hollywood past, like Who's That Girl is with respect to screwball comedies. And I found it to be really fascinating for multiple reasons. One is that the height of her film career is also the height of her kind of career on MTV as somebody who's not only very commercially successful, but also who is a lightning rod for the cultural wars, and very much kind of decisively so in terms of her production of the sex book and her talk about sex and her her queer advocacy during that period too, which I know has been problematized, but it's still, very notable and interesting for the period. And she is somebody who has consistently expressed interest in film, and she's trying to do this thing that was not like successful, quote unquote, in broad commercial and critical terms, although several of her movies were successful at the box office. Evita was rumored to almost get her an Oscar nomination, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was really revealing for this particular period in Hollywood, between the mid 80s and the mid 90s, where she's able to mine cultural controversy in her music career to great success. But that doesn't translate to having kind of a consistent star persona in business terms. And, a lot of that can be attributed to industrial sexism, so on and so forth. But what I was most interested in is the fact that the way that she viewed her star image was this very classical Hollywood style star image. And that incongruence really kind of spoke to me of the distance between, say, classic era Hollywood stars and how kind of fame worked within the 1990s, especially in the music industry, right? The 90s are thought of in terms of the movie industry as this like last hurrah for traditional movie stars now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the music industry, in this kind of narrow cast context, you could decisively turn a lot of people off and have great business success in that respect. So for me, it's kind of similar to Elvis's career, as like there is some aspect of recovery here of just saying like this is something that was culturally discarded, but is in fact rich and interesting at the very least from a historical perspective in terms of the needle that is attempting to be thread in terms of trying to connect these various types of stardom together, and the fact that they don't quite connect is in many ways more interesting than if they did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, you can imagine I was quite interested in your discussion of Dick Tracy, an important failure for Disney, but an important success for Stephen Sondheim, and also Vogue, right? I mean, Vogue is such a rich text for thinking through this performances of alterity that you give us, and the citational practice therein. I'm wondering, as we kind of round the curve in our discussion, one of the benefits of talking to you now in 2024, since this book has been out for a little bit now, is thinking about what has happened since. And I'm curious if if you had to write a postscript or a second edition, is there something that's happened in the history of or the recent past, I should say, of rock stars and the film industry or the media industries more broadly, that piqued your interest? I was thinking of the Beyonce, Taylor Swift concert films, but I'm curious to hear where your thought is. I mean, rock star there would be used a bit liberally, but yeah.
Yeah. And those are all good points. I do. Yeah, that's one reason I kind of try to point forward in the coda using, using one of Janelle Monáe's visual albums as to kind of
sure, yeah,
taking these ideas outside of cinema specifically and just kind of thinking about, the manifestation of popular music stardom across different types of moving image media. So I do think that the kind of freedom of form that the internet provides is an interesting place to extend some of these ideas, because a visual album is like kind of both a music video and a feature film, and also not at the same time, in a way that is functions, natively to a digital context in ways that wouldn't work in a broadcast context or in a motion picture theatrical context. And that something like Lemonade, for example, is, you're talking about citational practices, right? Is something that is a visual album, but also in terms of its nods to Julie Dash and so on and so forth, like cinephilic in its own way too. I think if I were to kind of write an additional chapter in a second edition, I would want to speak to this kind of current moment in which it seems that, in the 2020s, it feels like we are living through a rough transitional moment in terms of the movie industry. And it's going to come out into being something different. Theatrical movies, I don't think are going to die, right? But it feels like the studios don't know what to do. People aren't going to the movies as much. It kind of feels like the early to mid 1960s a little bit. And so, I wrote a small piece for the Velvet Light Trap that came out last year that's on Harry Styles and his performance in films like The Eternals, where he was on, an end credits tag in that film, as well as Don't Worry Darling and My Policeman. And in this era where it seems that like stardom doesn't matter, in terms of the infrastructure of filmmaking as it does during the period in which I'm writing about, what role does stardom have? Because I think stardom is still meaningful. It still means something. I remember I teach a large lecture course, and before I teach, to kind of break the ice, I'll go over to students and just ask them what they've watched recently. I remember when Don't Worry Darling came out, and a lot of students said Don't Worry Darling, specifically because of both Florence Pugh, but also because of Harry Styles. Sure. And they were saying it wasn't because of the controversy around the film that they wanted to see it. So I'm like, okay, movie stars matter to them, right? Or stars matter to them. Even though IP has kind of replaced stars and genre as what it is that motivates films to get made. So what is the value of somebody like Harry Styles to Don't Worry Darling, or to him being kind of integrated into the Marvel Cinematic Universe? And that's kind of I guess that kind of gets to one of the things I wanted to prove with this book, is that film stardom is not something that is like meaningful to film. Like, one question I got a lot while I was writing this book is like, is David Bowie really a movie star? Is Prince really a movie star? And to me, what undergirds that question is a really kind of classical Hollywood idea of a movie star, or at least an idea of a movie star inherited from the 1990s in terms of it correlating with box office, right?
Sure.
And to me, film stardom is a presentation of a media star personality through a certain medium that has a degree of significance culturally and economically, but that culture and economic significance doesn't necessarily redound to film, right? Movies were useful to a lot of these rock stars, not because they necessarily made them into what we would most rigidly consider a movie star, right? But because movies play a role in this kind of more horizontal landscape of media that is meaningful, and movies have kind of a role that's both convergent but also distinct and powerful in of itself. So one of the things I wanted to do with that book is just kind of uncover the terms by which movie stardom is useful for various parties in terms of this kind of work.
Well said. So what are you working on now? What's piqued your attention and, dare I say, is the subject of book 2?
Yeah. So like many people who have written a first book, I've been spending a lot more time thinking about the second book. So I'm working on a book right now on Motown Productions, which was Motown's film and television production company. Which made things like the Jackson 5 cartoon series and things like that, but they also tried to make a big splash in Hollywood in the 1970s with anything from Lay Sings the Blues to The Wiz, and then went on to make some films and TV movies and TV specials in the 1980s. And so one question that I got a lot while writing this first book was, what about Diana Ross? And so that led me to the second book, and I grew up listening to Motown on all these radio stations as my parents drove me around. And so that music has always meant something to me. And I think what I'm really interested in exploring with this book is, I cover a narrower historical period than my first book, but to kind of think about the role of the production company within Hollywood in as kind of a power center as the industry of Hollywood was decentered within this post-classical period. I think production companies were vitally important in the 1970s in terms of, what the New York Times called at the time the Black movie boom, that was primarily present in terms of blaxploitation, but was also present in terms of all sorts of movies as well. And Motown's aims to kind of do in the movie business what it did in the record industry, which was to desegregate mainstream entertainment, and then Motown, especially with movie starring Billy D. Williams that they had, but also Diana Ross's first 2 films, really tried to make kind of similar to Madonna, kind of really old school Hollywood entertainment in the 1970s. So that's on the way.
Well, I look forward to that. There's so much we could talk about with it, but we'll let you write it first. It's been a pleasure talking with you today, Landon. Thank you so much for your time. The book is sorry.
I was just gonna say thanks, Pete. I really
Yeah, no, it's always a pleasure to talk with someone about their work, and this is such a generative book, and I hope listeners will take it up. The book is Rockstar Movie Star: Power and Performance in Cinematic Rock Stardom, available now from Oxford University Press and other online booksellers. This is Pete Kunze, and this has been New Books and Film on the New Books Network. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.